We'll wait a few minutes as people are trickling in. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chelsea Gauthier. I am the Utah Main Street Manager and Statewide Coordinator. Thank you for joining this quarter's Ask an Architect webinar. I will pass the torch over to Jansen and Faith.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with you as we continue our Ask an Architect development series. So today we're going to be talking specifically about integrating brand identity through renovation. Um, just to catch you up on where we are, in May we talked about building inventories and how to set one up and why it's important that we use it. In August we talked about building matchmaking. If you have questions about either of those two topics, you can refer to our previous webinars. They were recorded. Today, again, we're talking about how to integrate brand identity into your buildings through renovation. And then in February, we'll be discussing appropriate new construction and development within a historic district or within a Main Street district. We are also in the midst of planning next year's Ask an Architect webinars. So if you have any questions or suggestions that you would like us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us. So I also want to say that you'll notice that the branding of this slide deck is very different. One of the reasons for that is because I presented on this topic this past April at the National Main Street Conference. And it is such a pertinent subject that we wanted to integrate it within this whole series that we're doing. So that's why all the branding is going to be off. I want to start off by discussing what's in a brand. Oftentimes, when we think of a brand, we think of a logo, and that is kind of where we stop in thinking about it. But a brand is much, much more. A good brand should evoke an emotional connection with consumers and and really kind of drive loyalty and make sure that when they think of you, they have a very clear understanding of what your business is and makes them feel something. It is also important that the brand conveys the values, mission, and lifestyle of a business. So you want to make sure that your target demographic, your customers feel really comfortable going to you and that they understand what it is that you stand for. A good brand is also very carefully crafted. It would be really nice if we could just get a logo and then call it good, but a brand is really so much more than that. It is something that is kind of nuanced and ephemeral, in addition to having the actual logo, typography, colors, all those things. And because it's so ephemeral and we are looking for that emotional connection, it's something that you have to be intentional with. And especially making sure that you are consistent with promoting your brand identity throughout everything you do. It is also typically developed graphically in 2 dimensions before making the leap to 3 dimensions. So if you are wanting to integrate your brand identity into your space, it's a good place to start on paper. And you want to start by developing a logo, developing your mission, your value statement. You want to make sure that you know who you are and that that isn't going to change before you invest a whole bunch of money into changing your space. So start with 2 dimensions and then work up into 3. So to help understand your brand identity, you should start by asking a few questions. First, it's important to know yourself. Know who you are and what you stand for. Part of that is what makes your business unique. And Tied in with that is what gives you a competitive advantage. Oftentimes in our Main Street districts, we see multiple businesses that have the same business type. A good Main Street should not just have one restaurant. There should be multiple restaurants, but you should also understand what makes you unique and what sets you apart from the others. Each restaurant can have their niche. It's not necessarily a zero sum game where you're trying to beat out all the competitors, but you want to make sure that you're targeting your customers within your niche really, really tightly with your brand identity. You also want to ask yourself what makes you familiar or relatable. Why do your customers keep coming back to you? With that, now that you know yourself, you also need to think about your audience. You need to know who you are trying to market towards, what they're looking for, what their priorities are, and how much they're willing to spend. Those three questions should give you a fairly close idea of who your target demographic is, what their age groups are, how much money they have, what they're willing to spend their money on, and what they're willing to spend extra money on to get. So the third thing is you need to focus on the details and how they are communicating with your target audience, as well as setting you apart and helping your audience understand who you are. So you want to think about what colors, fonts, images, and the presentation of those, how they reinforce your values and mission statement, how they not only communicate what you stand for, but make it very clear that you stand for those things. You also need to make sure that your logo and the way you are talking with your audience resonates with them. Typically, this can be done through like an off-the-cuff survey of when people come into your store or your location. You can ask them, like, hey, what do you think of, like, why do you come in? Who do you think we are? Are we communicating that effectively? And it's just good to see and do that market research to see what people actually think about you, and why they keep coming back. Because you could think that your target demographic is one thing, but you're actually communicating to a separate demographic. And that is kind of a good problem to have, because then you can, one, reinforce and kind of tweak what you're doing to get a larger demographic, but also keep and maintain the people you are targeting, who are resonating with your message and your brand. The fourth is to be cohesive. You want to make sure that your brand identity and your business presents itself the same across all virtual and physical platforms, and that your physical space. So oftentimes we think of like physical platforms as like if you send out any advertising or your signage or any of those things, but also make sure that your location and your space really kind of drives home your brand identity and resonates with that. It shouldn't be a disconnect between all of your advertising and your location. All right. That's all a lot of information. And I find it really helpful to look at an existing business, to see what they do and how they do it. I'm using Starbucks for this example, although most successful businesses, if you type in their name and then branding, there are probably reports that have been written about them, because business students need need projects to work on and topics for their projects. But Starbucks is one that most of us are probably familiar with. So I want to start with their mission. So their stated mission is to be the premier purveyor of the finest coffee in the world, inspiring and nurturing the human spirit, one person, one cup, and one neighborhood at a time. And I want you to note how their mission is not just to like be the premier purveyor of the finest coffee in the world. Like that is the very like simplest element of their mission statement. But then the second part is to inspire and nurture the human spirit at an individual and a community level. And that's really tricky to do. And just because someone says this is their mission statement doesn't necessarily mean it is. So then we can look and see how they're trying to communicate those things through their brand identity. Their values are also like, I like how they have like a mini mission statement as their value statement. When we show up at our best, we deliver performance through the lens of humanity. So again, very in sync with their mission statement. And their values are craft, courage, results, belonging, and joy. And all of that seems very ephemeral. None of those things are physical things that you can touch, but they are things that they are trying to communicate as they kind of present themselves through their marketing and their locations. So let's look at the actual elements that they are using to try to communicate those things. First is the graphic elements. They have both a logo, well, they have kind of two logos. They have the siren, and then they have what they call the word mark, where there's like the logo and then the words that go with it. They also have a color palette that they use. And I want you to note that their color palette is fairly large. It's not just one color of green. It is a color of green, accent colors, blacks, and like off-white and a very bright white. Like they have a whole bunch of colors selected that complement each other and that can be used in a wide variety of media. It can be used on social media, it can be used in print, it can be used on their packaging. They select a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of colors, so that they have a good palette to choose from to meet a variety of needs. They also have a variety of typefaces. You'll note that some of them that there are essentially three or four. I selected these three from their website, but you'll notice that neither of the Soto Sans or Lander are the typeface within their logo. So their logo stands alone as something very easily identifiable, but then they have the additional typefaces that they can use in print, on their packaging, on their website. They try to set up their brand and these graphic elements so that they can be adaptable to any situation that comes up. Oftentimes, when I see people starting to like create a brand identity, they stop too soon. They try to narrow it down to one thing when they can use multiple things to be creative. And so those are the graphic elements. Now we're going to look at how they actually apply them. So on their website, I got a new screenshot from today. So they have their holiday line out. So hence lots of red, but it's very simple, but still maintains the colors, the typography, the logo. Everything is very consistent with their brand identity. Similarly, on their social media. With social media platforms, there is lots that you cannot change. But with the things that they can change, they have tried really hard to integrate their identity. So they have their siren logo as the kind of profile picture. And then they are making sure that everything that goes up there is very clearly branded with their typography, that they are communicating their values of like craft and joy and belonging, all of those things through their social media. And finally, in their physical locations, they keep to the color palette as much as they can. And then they also make sure that Starbucks does a really good job of kind of complementing They're darker green and grays with a really warm accent color, typically wood and lighting in their locations. And again, you don't see an orange in their um, as one of their colors, but they're using actual physical materials really wisely to complement their brand. So, Starbucks, say what you will, but they do have a very cohesive brand identity throughout their locations, their print, their websites, their social media, all those things. But now we get to the tricky part. Oh, sorry, one other note. I'm getting ahead of myself. You should also know when to change your brand. Oftentimes we think of businesses as very static things where we set up the brand identity, we're communicating who we are, it's being successful, and then we don't ever revisit it. But your business changes and evolves and grows over time. And so every so often, it's a good idea to revisit your brand identity and to consider, are there things that we need to tweak? These are just some of the fun examples of how brands have changed. Starbucks is at the very bottom. So from 1971 through 2019, you can see how it's changed to specifically to still communicate their values, but in a changed world. So their target demographic has remained the same, but they are constantly evolving their brand to continue to communicate to new people, and especially people who were not alive in the 1970s. And it's a very different world. All right, so now we get to the tricky part is how do we incorporate brand identity into our spaces to have experiential design. Now, experiential design is a kind of jargony term that is kind of thrown around a lot in architect and interior designy spheres. But I want to talk briefly about the power of experience. This is from a Forbes article in 2019. And the author says the most successful companies right now are those that have figured out how to reimagine every touch point a consumer has with their brand, delivering an experience-based emotional connection. So again, instead of offering a product, your business is also offering an experience that resonates on an emotional level. I want to talk briefly about this photo. So this is a crazy example of experiential design. So Balenciaga released a new bag and it was pink leather. And to celebrate the release, they invited a whole bunch of people to their store and they lined every surface imaginable, floors, walls, columns, shelves, everything in pink faux fur. And it's slightly ridiculous, but it is a clear example of if you went to that opening, it was an experience. And it was an experience that definitely made you feel things. And so, although we don't want to go to that extreme level, we do want to make sure that our consumers are having a good experience when they enter our spaces and that that experience is hammering home our values and our mission as a business and making them feel comfortable where they are. So, we want to talk briefly about function, about how our spaces work. So, we have functional needs in our businesses. We have employee needs and we have customer needs, and they are not the same. An employee is going to be there day in and day out and needs to be able to do their job. So you need to think about not only what actual physical spaces the employee needs to do every day, needs to be able to do their job every day, but also to make sure that it is comfortable and that you're looking at not only what happens every day, but where it happens. So making sure that the break room is kind of secluded and that that your employees aren't taking a break on the showroom floor, like all those sorts of things. But you also need to consider the customer's needs. What's drawing them in from the street? And then what do they do once they're inside? How do they engage with your product or your service? And then once we understand the functional needs, we can talk about how it looks, the aesthetics. And it's important to delineate between the permanent elements and the impermanent elements. So when you're thinking about permanent elements, that's like the structural, the like the windows, all those sorts of things. You want to make sure that the permanent elements ensure life safety and thermal comfort. And you should also note that they are incredibly difficult to change. And so you want to make sure that those are fairly neutral, that once you invest in kind of the walls, the um, like windows, the doors, all those things, that they have good bones, that you aren't going to have to change them again very quickly. And then you can look at the impermanent elements. They're not integral to the building's performance, and they're alterable depending a little bit on how permanent they are and their price. So paint, super inexpensive, super easy to change. It doesn't take any specialized skill. It's just there and it's relatively inexpensive. Light fixtures are a little bit more on the permanent side of the spectrum, where they aren't terribly expensive compared to like a building structural element or a window. But they also do require at least a little bit of specialized skill. They typically you can't really replace a light fixture while a building is open. All those sorts of, well, a building is open for business, I should clarify. All of those things are relatively easy to change, but there's a spectrum there. The impermanent elements are where you want to focus your brand identity the most. You want to make sure that the permanent elements meet all of your functional and spatial needs, and then you can add the kind of creativity, the colors, the more experiential elements on the impermanent elements to really make sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck and you aren't going to be spending a lot every time that your brand alters. So, for example, here is a new build Starbucks in T, South Dakota. And this is the floor plan. We're going to look briefly at the functional needs of all of the different groups. So, these are the employee needs. You'll note that they are relatively small compared to the entirety of the building, actually, maybe about 50%, but they are very like they exist on a spectrum of available to the customer versus completely secluded. And so you can see, for example, right here, I hope you can see my cursor, but right here you have like the locker room area, and then the manager's office is like the most secluded. And so you want to make sure that that all of the functional needs are being addressed. Then there's the customer needs, making sure that your customer has a good experience and that it's very clear where they can and cannot go. And then you have what are the most important spaces where they overlap. So those are the touch points where your employees and your customers are interacting, need to be most the most important spaces to really drive home your brand identity. And we can look and see how Starbucks did this. So from the exterior, it looks like any other Starbucks. The exterior is primarily for the customers, and you really want it to be recognizable. And this is very clearly identifiable as a Starbucks. On the interior, you can see that they have put the most care, the brightest lights, the like all the signage, the most wood paneling, all those things right at the counter. That's that touch point where the customers and the employees are interacting. And then on the customer seating, the lighting is a little bit dimmer. They're focusing really on the comfort as opposed to the interaction with the brand. And I want to note here, the way that they've used materials. So the wood paneling is, sorry, I'm going to take a step back. So the layout of the store right here is going to remain the same essentially forever. Functionally, it works. They probably will never have to relocate the restroom somewhere else. They aren't going to have to change the counter at all or the counter location. Everything is working for the needs that they have. And then the places where they're incorporating their brand identity is really in the materials. And so you can see that they have lots of wood paneling. That's one of the more permanent elements. And it's also one of the most neutral elements. A wood paneling is going to complement any colors, any kind of changes they have. And it also complements really nicely with the artwork that they have currently. The artwork is one of the most impermanent elements. They can take that artwork down and replace it with something different right away. And it would change the way the space looks, and it would change the kind of values and core mission that they are communicating to their customers. So it's a really good and interesting use of looking at like your brand, looking at your building, and making changes to the building to make sure that it is addressing both needs, the functional and the aesthetic. It is a little bit trickier when you're dealing with an existing building, though, because instead of being able to construct something new to meet your needs, you already have something to work with. And so there are a few additional considerations. You want to look at the practical considerations. The first of which is making sure that you understand what the building was used for historically, what its current use is, and also what its proposed use is. So, for example, if your building was initially a bank and then it housed a restaurant, and now you want to use it for a bookstore, each of those kind of uses have different needs. And so you want to look and make sure that your building, like the building, will meet your needs. We talked a lot about this during our building matchmaking webinar. So if you have additional questions about that, I'd start with that webinar. The next thing is you need to make sure that your building is in good condition. If there are structural, weather-related, or cosmetic damage or damaged elements, then you need to consider how you're going to replace them before you consider making aesthetic improvements. And then you also need to look at how much time and money you have for a rehabilitation project, because that's going to determine your priorities and where you can put your money. In addition, you should also take into account historic considerations. These are not only for making sure that your building continues to contribute to the vibe of your district, but can also help you determine whether or not there are financial incentives available to your building. So, if the building is located in a historic district, that as a contributing building, and also whether it's a local or national register building, then it could open up grant opportunities as well as the opportunity for tax credits or other financial incentives. If it is on a local register, then there may be additional zoning or review requirements required by the city. The next thing is you should monitor is whether or not the building maintains historic character or if the historic character has been changed in the recent past. So typically we look at historic character as anything 50 years old or older. So if your building has changed significantly in the last 50 years, then you may have a little more leeway in identifying the historic character defining features. The next thing is to look at what those character defining features are. What makes your building unique and what kind of makes it identifiable as a historic building. Those are all things that you want to look at before you make plans to change anything. So we're going to look at another Starbucks. This one is in Seattle and it's the Starbucks Roastery. And this is the building they started with. It is an old car showroom, and so you can see the kind of unique construction of that, where it has really, really big openings because historically they drove cars in and wanted to show cars in this building. And so lots of really big windows. It was also built in the 1920s in kind of a Spanish revival style. And so it has terracotta detailing, it has a very prominent cornice line, as well as some interesting detailing at the columns. And so this is the building they're starting with. And we're going to look for character defining features. I already mentioned some of them, but the way we kind of identify the character defining features is to look at the setting, what is similar and different between your building and the buildings around it, looking at the broad strokes, so the shape of the building, if it's 1 story or 2 stories, the openings, how they're arranged, if it's symmetrical or asymmetrical, as well as the materials and how they've been treated and what condition they are. And then you can look at the details, the function of whether, a window is operable or not, where the door is located, whether it opens in or out, the ornament and style of the building, all of those sorts of things. And we don't want to alter any character defining features if we can avoid it. So again, this is a 1 story building. It has the very prominent openings that take up the majority of the wall, but anything that is not an opening is very clearly detailed, has lots of ornamentation, and is really identifiable as a historic revival style building. And so this is how Starbucks treated the exterior. They kept almost everything intact. They repaired what they could, and then they replaced a few elements to and a few select elements to really make it their own. So primarily at the entrance. So you'll note that here, those are like hollow metal entry doors, and they changed it to wood entry doors that are slightly larger, but still within the kind of historic opening. They also replaced one medallion at in the center of kind of that semicircle parapet right above the door, and they replaced it with a siren. And then the biggest change they made was the paint. So they kept all of the historic steel windows and they painted them, which is a relatively inexpensive thing, but has a really big impact in how the building feels from before to after. So they were really wise in how they spent their money to really bring forward their brand identity here. On the interior, it was really just kind of a big open space because of it being a car showroom, but they took kind of very small steps to make sure that it still felt like a Starbucks. So they still have a very prominent counter in kind of that same coppery orange color that we saw in the South Dakota example, as well as they took lots of care to make sure that like any changes they made to the building, like the HVAC, were differentiated yet compatible. All of the light fixtures are kind of subdued, they aren't calling attention to themselves, but they are keeping lots of the interior character defining features like the wooden columns, the exposed roof decking and structure. All of those things are still there, but they also brought in a whole bunch of things to make it feel like a Starbucks and make sure that the historic identity and the current identity are compatible with each other. So now it's your turn. I'm going to present to you an example of a building and a potential tenant, and I want you to think about what you would change to really drive home the brand identity. So this is our case study exercise. It is at 1486 Central Avenue in Dubuque, Iowa. And there's the exterior and the interior. Here are a few things to know about it. It is again in Dubuque, Iowa. It was built in 1887 and historically housed an undertaker's business. It is 1,300 square feet in the commercial space with a 1,000 square feet rear addition, and it is a contributing building to to the national and local historic districts. This is the floor plan. So a very open commercial space. There is an apartment above that we won't be touching. And there's also a rear addition that is single story, about 1,000 square feet. For the purposes of this exercise, all of the functional elements, so bathrooms, kitchens, all those sorts of things are going in the rear addition and will, for the most part, not be visible to any customers. So we're pushing a whole bunch of functional things into the rear addition. All right. So here are some of the character defining features that we don't want to change the form or necessarily the material of. So on the exterior, we have the cornice line is very indicative of the time period in which it was built. We also have the size of the openings on, and especially at the street level, as well as there is the original historic door and the like column that separates the apartment entry from the commercial entry. So those are all things we don't want to change. On the other side, or on the inside, sorry, there are only two kind of big character defining features. There is the pressed tin ceiling, which we don't want to change at all, if possible, aside from paint. And there's also the original hardwood floor that can be refinished, but should stay intact. There's also kind of this like openness of the space that we don't want to change much, if at all possible. So I want you to take a, oh, so there's the building. All right, now let's look at the potential tenant. This is Reading in Public, which is a bookstore and cafe. This will be their second location. So they're keeping this one that is in a new build building, but they want to open in Dubuque. And so here is a little bit about their brand identity. So they're like the way they identify themselves is that Reading in Public is a people-centric, independent bookstore built on the belief that life is composed of stories. And this is their existing space. And I want to note a few of the material choices as well as the branding choices. So they have their logo is kind of that slanted sans serif. Their prominent color is the kind of light pink. But aside from that, they have a fairly minimal aesthetic. So the furniture is not super extravagant. The bookshelves are really pared back. They're in a kind of soft golden wood tone. And then they have lots of white accents. So that is kind of a little bit to go off of. And I want you to take just a few minutes to think about the functional needs of the employees, the functional needs for the customers, and where you can aesthetically incorporate elements of the tenant's brand identity. And we'll just kind of brainstorm about this for a moment. And we can do it silently. But in a minute, I'll show you what I would propose. All right. So now that you've had a moment to think about what you would change, here are the things that I proposed for this. So on the exterior, I took the already painted surface and made it more pink to tie in with the reading in public. I also changed the typeface of the address number, the um, building number, as well as added a little bit of signage, but left almost everything else intact. I also brought the existing cornice color, down to the windows to make it feel a little more cohesive, and then also brought it into the interior with the pressed tin ceiling. That is mostly just to make it identifiable as something a little bit different from their other location. Then lots of everything else is I added wood paneling on the back wall to match the floor, as well as their other location. And then did paint, signage, and then a whole bunch of furniture choices that really reinforce their brand identity. Um, Again, this is looking primarily at making very small changes that don't cost a lot of money, but have a very big impact on the way the space is perceived. So, from the existing condition to the new condition, those are the things that I changed, really to drive home the brand identity of the space. So, a few final thoughts. Remember that branding should reflect the mission and values of a business. It's more than a logo. It's how we communicate and really resonate emotionally with our customers. Incorporating the brand elements into the architecture of a business helps create an experiential product. Instead of just coming in for whatever product or service is offered, it becomes an experience that a customer looks forward to and becomes a stronger experience than if they are just entering a kind of nondescript building. Care should also be taken to protect character defining features of historic buildings. It helps you kind of create that experience as well as maintain the character of your district. So, though that those are kind of the highlights. And now I am happy to take any questions.
Rachel, it looks like you raised your hand. Let me make sure you could talk. All right, you should be able to unmute.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
And
Perfect. Hey, Jansen, just a quick question. You had mentioned local historic districts and national historic districts.
Yeah.
Is one stronger than the other in terms of grant possibilities? And is it required to have that local or national historic designation for some of the funding that you're talking about?
excellent, sorry, excellent question. So, national historic districts and local districts are two very different things. So, the National Historic District means that the district has been like officially registered on the National Register of Historic Places. That involves our office and working with us to kind of go through the process of identifying what's in the district, what buildings are and are not contributing to the story of the district's history, as well as nominating it and kind of communicating all of that to the National Park Service, who make it official and actually list the district on the National Register. National Register listing does not bring any kind of red tape or any requirements to keep the district as is. I often give the example that if a building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it could be demolished the next day and nothing bad would happen to the property owner. There would be no fines. I would probably cry, but it would like nothing bad would really happen. Um, However, the reason you nominate a building to the National Register of Historic Places is one, for the honor. It's an honorary designation, but also it does open the door for a wide variety of financial incentives. So the majority of those are given through our office through grants or our tax credit program. There are also other nonprofits and other people who give grants who do look at whether the building is listed on the National Register or not as part of their application and review process. So the National Register doesn't come with any strings attached, but does open the door to financial incentives. A local register is done typically at the city level and is done primarily without our involvement. We don't advise, we don't talk about anything with the city as they are doing that generally, but the local district may or may not offer financial incentives. I'm not aware of any that do, like any cities that look for like facade improvement grants or any other grants, and tie that funding to whether or not a property is listed on a local historic district. But local historic districts often come with like specific zoning or review requirements. One of the most kind of common is to have a landmarks commission review any changes that a property owner wants to make to the building, and approve or deny those changes. So the national, in kind of summary, the National Register designation comes with financial incentives and no strings attached. The local historic district often comes with strings attached, but I'm not aware of any additional financial incentives that would come. It's also possible for a building to be listed both on a national and a local historic district. And it's important to know who to talk to when that happens. For example, if you own a building that is listed in both, you would talk to us for financial incentives. You would talk with your city about any additional steps within a review or permitting process.
Great, thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? Megan, go ahead.
There we go. Thank you. I had a question about the branding and how
Yeah.
you designed the interior of that building.
Uh-huh.
Is that a service that you offer? Because we've got a lot of older buildings, and when we're talking to building owners and trying to talk them into doing these revitalization grants, they're visual learners. And so I think if we were able to show them pictures of what it could be, I know there's lots of AI out there that we could utilize, but is that something that we have access
So
to?
that is not a service we currently offer to this level of um, like with me putting together an actual graphic thing. I am available to currently to come and meet with property owners, discuss their goals, and talk them through something like this, but it usually doesn't come with a visual like this. It is something that we are looking at offering during the next fiscal year. That will be like, there's only one of me for the entire state. And so it will probably be on like a service that you apply for sort of a
Sure.
basis. Whereas I'm happy, like if someone were to reach out and say like, hey, we're looking at this building, can you help me talk through any changes to make? I'm happy to discuss, but the like actual physical images or floor plans and things like that is a service we're looking at providing in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Of course. Excellent. Any other questions?
Doesn't look like it yet. There's nothing in the chat.
If you do have additional questions, here is my contact information. I'm happy to discuss anything, any questions that you may have. Also, I'm going to put in another plug. If there is a topic you'd like to see me cover in a future Ask an Architect webinar, feel free to send that my way. And otherwise, then I will just say thank you so much for attending today. And I look forward to hearing your questions in the future.